Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a journey that is not merely about death, but about what consciousness truly is when everything we call life falls away. Today we begin with the first day after death, the moment when the deceased awakens not as a body, but as awareness itself. And what the Tibetan Book of the Dead reveals is astonishing. Death is not disappearance, but the liberation of consciousness. This is not metaphor. It is a description of what the mind experiences when its final illusions collapse. One death as the final stripping away of illusion. We tend to imagine death as annihilation, a void, an ending. But in the Tibetan tradition, and increasingly in neuroscience and depth, psychology, death is understood as something far more profound. It is the moment when all artificial boundaries dissolve. Your name, your story, your memories, your victories and failures. Everything you thought was you begins to fall away like dust. And what remains? Pure awareness, the silent witness, the I beneath the personal identity. The Tibetan Book of the Dead Bardo Thodol maps this moment with extraordinary precision. Although written for the deceased, it is in fact a guide to the living. Because the landscape the dead walk through is the same landscape we walk through every night in dreams, and every day in the depths of our subconscious. This is not an external heaven or hell. This is the inner architecture of your own mind. 2. The first day when the soul looks down at its own body. Now imagine the deceased. The moment the breath stops, the heart falls silent. From the outside, it looks like nothing more than biological cessation. But from the inside, another reality begins. The physical eyes have closed, but the eyes of consciousness have opened. The deceased looks down and sees a startling sight, their own lifeless body lying on the bed or the ground. And then comes the first great philosophical question. If that is my body, and I am the one observing it, then who am I? This is not a poetic question. It is the first awakening, the recognition that consciousness was never identical with the flesh that contained it. Freud described the death drive thanatos, not merely as the desire toward destruction, but as the instinct to dissolve the ego and return to a more fundamental unity. And in this first moment after death, the soul experiences both the joy of dissolution, freedom from limitation, and the terror of disappearance, fear of losing identity. This tension marks the doorway into the Bardo, the in-between realm where consciousness is confronted with its own truth. For many in the West, the word Bardo may sound mystical or exotic, but philosophically it refers to something universal, a transitional state, a gap between what was and what will be, a psychological and spiritual interval. In Tibetan Buddhism, the Bardo lasts up to 49 days, during which the soul has a rare chance to awaken from its illusions and break free from rebirth. But here is the deeper teaching, the part Western psychology often agrees with. The Bardo is not only after death, it is within us right now. We enter mini Bardos every time we lose someone, lose a job, lose a belief, lose our identity, confront our own unconscious, face the collapse of something we thought was permanent. The death of the ego is a rehearsal for the death of the body. Thus, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is not a religious book. It is a manual for awakening. 4. The monk speaks sound as a bridge to the disembodied mind. On the first day after death, a monk kneels beside the body and begins to read aloud. But his voice is not meant for the living. It is a lifeline thrown into the ocean of consciousness. When the monk speaks, his words function not as language, but as frequency of vibration that the wandering soul can perceive even without ears. This is not superstition. Modern physics tells us sound is vibration. Vibration is energy. Consciousness responds to energy. The monk's chant is like a lighthouse for a ship lost in an unfamiliar sea. His words say, "Do not fear the light. Do not cling to your memories. Do not run from the truth. Because the moment the soul turns away from the pure light, the clear light of reality, it begins to fall back into habits, illusions, and eventually rebirth. This is why guidance matters. This is why the voice is essential. In Western psychological terms, death is the collapse of the ego boundary. The conscious mind dissolves, and the unconscious expands without limit. This is why the Tibetan tradition describes the soul seeing brilliant lights, frightening shapes, unfamiliar sounds, overwhelming clarity, overwhelming fear. None of these are external entities. They are projections of the mind, magnified now that the body no longer shields consciousness from its own depth. What we experience after death is what we carried within us during life, but intensified. 6. The soul's first realization. I am not the body. Back to the deceased, as they observe their former body, a realization dawns. That body was a garment I wore, but I am the awareness that witnessed everything. This insight is the foundation of nearly every mystical tradition. Stoicism said, "You are not your flesh, you are your ruling mind." Christianity said the body dies, but the spirit returns to God. Plato taught that the body is a temporary prison of the soul. Hinduism says the body is a costume worn by the Atman. And neuroscience increasingly argues that consciousness cannot be fully explained by physical processes alone. Ironically, death may be the first time a person realizes what they truly are. 7. Death is not the end. It is the revelation. So when the Tibetan text says, "Death is not disappearance but the liberation of consciousness," it is not announcing a doctrine. It is describing an experience. Death is the moment truth reveals itself. The moment consciousness stops pretending to be a personality, a profession, or a name. Death ends the story, but awakens the storyteller. 8. This is not religion. It is inner science. Many Westerners hear these teachings and assume they belong to religion. But the Tibetan Book of the Dead is more psychology than theology. It tells us how fear works, how attachment works, how identity dissolves, how consciousness perceives itself, how illusions arise, how liberation is possible. It is a manual for understanding the mind under the most extreme conditions, the moment of death. This is why Carl Jung encouraged Western psychologists to read the Bardo, because it reveals what the unconscious looks like when it is fully awake. 9. Why we study the first day. You may ask, why does this matter to the living? Because the first day after death reflects the deepest patterns of our inner life, our fear of letting go, our clinging to identity, our blindness to our deeper nature, our struggle with impermanence, our longing for truth, our avoidance of truth. Every fear we face in life is a small rehearsal for the moment we face ourselves without the body. This is why studying the first day of Bardo is not about preparing for death. It is about understanding life. If you wish to continue this journey, through philosophy, psychology, sacred texts, and the deepest questions of consciousness, this channel speaks about death. But in truth, we are learning how to live more honestly, more consciously, and more courageously. Thank you for walking this first step with me. The journey continues. Today we step into one of the most mysterious moments in the entire journey of consciousness. The very first day after death, when the soul sheds its senses, encounters pure vibration, and faces the blinding light of its true nature. But before we begin, remember, this is not a religious sermon nor a mystical fantasy. This is a philosophical, psychological, and metaphysical exploration into what the Tibetan Book of the Dead calls the most critical moment of existence, the moment when awareness confronts itself. One, the soul as a pure, wave being, a shift beyond the senses. In spiritual psychology and Western parapsychology, the moment after physical death is described in a striking way. The consciousness no longer possesses the five senses. The soul becomes what scholars call a pure vibrational entity, a being that no longer hears sound but directly feels vibration. This idea is not limited to Tibetan mysticism. Quantum consciousness theorists like Penrose and Hameroff propose similar models, that consciousness is structured not through matter, but through frequency, resonance, and information fields. In this state, perception becomes immediate, unfiltered, and shockingly intimate. Thus, when the monk speaks over the body, his chant is not heard through ears. It is absorbed. The sound becomes a wave that ripples directly through the consciousness of the departed. And in this first moment of transition, the monk recites, "O soul, you have shed the shell of the body. Fear not, for everything you see now is nothing but the shadow of your own mind." This sentence may be the most psychologically profound line in the entire Tibetan canon. Why? Because it implies that at the moment of death, the external world dissolves, and the mind becomes the sole architect of reality. There is no outside. There is only projection. To the Western philosophical ear, this echoes Kant's transcendental idealism, the idea that the world as we know it is shaped by our perception. But the Tibetan tradition goes one step further. After death, the world is not simply shaped by perception. It is created by it. This is the beginning of what Tibetans call the Bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. 2. The first light, the encounter with the soul's true nature. As the soul absorbs the monk's chant, something extraordinary happens. The vibrations of sound give way, and the soul suddenly perceives light, not a light that shines on things, but a light that contains all things. The Tibetan Book of the Dead states, immediately after death, the soul beholds the pure light, the light of the Buddha, and simultaneously the light of its own true nature. This moment is called the first clear light, the radiant truth of what we fundamentally are, when stripped of every illusion, identity, and psychological mask. From a philosophical perspective, this moment mirrors the core of multiple Western traditions. Plato's idea of the good, the source of all reality. Spinoza's substance, the infinite indivisible essence of existence. Plotinus's one, the silent source of all consciousness. Heidegger's Lichtung, the clearing where being reveals itself. In every case, the light is not a symbol of salvation. It is the unveiling of what is eternally real. It is the moment where the soul sees itself without distortion. But here lies the paradox. The human soul, conditioned by fear and identity, usually cannot bear this light. It is too honest, too vast, too absolute. Because this light demands the dissolution of the ego, and the ego is terrified of disappearing. Thus, according to the Tibetan masters, most souls react in the same way. They retreat, they turn away, they flee back into darkness, and that single act, the refusal to face truth, becomes the first step toward rebirth. 3. The shadow of fear, the birth of the inner hell. The moment the soul turns from the light, a shadow rises around it, what Buddhism calls ignorance avidya, and psychology calls ego defense mechanism. The soul longs for something familiar, its body, its memories, its old identity, but none of that exists anymore. So the mind grasps at impressions, symbols, and unresolved emotions. And then it happens. The unconscious begins to project. Repressed anger bursts forth as fire. Greed takes shape as a devouring wave. Jealousy becomes a blade that turns against the self. This is what spiritual psychology calls the self-generated hell. There is no demon, no eternal punishment, no external inferno. The only tormentor is the mind that refuses to let go. Dante described hell as a place where the lost souls go, but the Tibetan tradition is far more radical. Hell is not a destination. It is a psychological event. It appears only as long as the mind clings to fear and identity. Sartre said hell is other people, but the Tibetan masters counter with a far more piercing truth. Hell is not the other. Hell is everything within you that you refuse to face. In this sense, the afterlife becomes something deeply familiar to Western psychology, a mirror of one's own unresolved psyche. 4. The light is not salvation, it is self-recognition. The greatest misunderstanding of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is the belief that the light is salvation. It is not. The light does not rescue you. It does not redeem you. The light simply reveals. Liberation occurs only when the soul has the courage to recognize the light as itself. The Buddha cannot save you. The gods cannot save you. The monk cannot save you. Only recognition can. This is the heart of what Buddhists call one's original face. The true self before birth, before identity, before fear. To see this face, even for a second, is to be free. To reject it is to fall again into illusion. Thus, the doctrine is brutally honest. Enlightenment is not a divine gift. It is a psychological readiness. If the soul can bear truth, it is free. If not, it wanders. 5. Why the first day after death matters even for the living. Now you may wonder, why does any of this matter while we are alive? Because the first clear light is not just a post-mortem event. It is a metaphor for every moment of awakening in our lives. Every time you confront your fear, every time you see a truth you once avoided, every time your identity cracks open and something deeper emerges, you are encountering the first light. Death simply magnifies the process, and this is why the Tibetan Book of the Dead is ultimately not a guide for the dead, but a training manual for the living, a journey not into death but into ourselves. On the first day after death, the universe does not abandon the soul. It reveals it. It strips away illusion. It invites the soul to meet itself. Some run, some tremble, a rare few open their eyes. But in every case, the light waits with infinite patience. Because the light is not something you reach, it is something you recognize. And so, as we continue this journey into the Bardo, this map of consciousness beyond the body, remember, this is not a story about death. It is a story about who you truly are, when nothing is left to hide behind. If you wish to continue this deep exploration into the nature of the soul, and walk with me through the next gates of the Bardo, then please subscribe. Your presence here is another light on this path. In this session, we delve into one of the most intriguing and philosophically rich passages from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the experience of the deceased on the first day after death. To the untrained eye, this moment may appear mystical, metaphorical, or even unreal. But when we examine it through the lenses of psychology, depth psychology, philosophy, and consciousness studies, we find that this ancient text describes something astonishingly precise: the rebirth of the unconscious mind, on the first day after death, a psychological interpretation. Carl Jung once described death not as annihilation, but as the completion of individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the conscious and unconscious into a whole. He believed that even after the physical body dissolves, The psyche continues to exist in the form of symbols, images, and archetypes. So when the newly deceased encounters light and darkness, gods and demons, the Tibetan masters say, these are not external beings. They are projections of your own mind. And Jung would have agreed. For him, the unconscious speaks in symbols, and death is the moment when these symbols rise without resistance. Everything hidden, everything buried, everything unresolved bursts into view. Thus, the monk's recitation beside the dying person is not merely ritual. It is a form of psychological reintegration, a last attempt to help the fragmented psyche recognize itself. Every vibration of the monk's voice, every syllable of the sacred text, serves a purpose: to bind the scattered pieces of the unconscious back into unity. This is the psychological meaning of liberation. 2. A parapsychological interpretation, the soul as energy. Next, let us shift our lens to parapsychology. In this field, the soul is not conceptualized as a ghost or specter, but as a distinct energetic entity, an energy pattern with its own natural frequency. Death is not a stoppage. It is a transformation, an energetic shift. The frequency that once expressed itself through a three-dimensional body now moves into a four-dimensional field, and the monk's mantra performs an extraordinary function. It stabilizes this energy. Sound, after all, is vibration. Brainwaves are vibration. Emotion is vibration. And vibrations interact. So when the monk recites, the mantra forms a stable wave pattern that harmonizes the chaotic frequency of the transitioning soul. This is resonance not metaphorically, but in a literal energetic sense. Thus, the monk's chant is not prayer in the Western petitionary sense. It is a deliberate act of psycho-spiritual tuning, a realignment of consciousness, a return to equilibrium. 3. The soul's dilemma: reincarnate or liberate. At this moment, on the first day after death, the soul stands at a crossroads, to enter the light or to turn back toward darkness. The light feels overwhelming. The light dissolves the ego. The light promises total truth, which also means the end of everything false. The darkness, on the other hand, feels familiar. It contains the memories, identities, and desires through which the ego once defined itself. This is what philosophers call the paradox of existence. We become complete only in the light, but in that completeness our individuality disappears. So most souls hesitate, and hesitation becomes gravity. Gravity becomes return. Return becomes rebirth. We receive a name, a family, a story, a life, a new cycle of desire and disappointment, a new cycle of joy and suffering. But the monk whispers a final instruction. You are already a Buddha. You do not need to be born again. Enter the light. It has no beginning and no end. This is liberation, not escape but recognition. 4. Death as a mirror, a philosophical reflection. And now we arrive at the central insight. Death is not the disappearance of the self. It is the appearance of the truth the self has always carried. On the first day after death, the soul finally sees, not the world, not the gods, not heaven or hell, but itself. This is the first moment of pure self-awareness. The Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches us, hell is not other people. Hell is the mind's refusal to see itself. This is where psychology, Buddhism, and modern consciousness studies converge. Liberation is not achieved by fleeing darkness, nor by chasing the light. Liberation begins the moment we stop running, the moment we calmly see what is within us. My friends, this teaching is not simply about death. It is about life. Every fear we carry, every shadow we avoid, every unresolved desire we bury, all of these will meet us again at the threshold of death, not to punish us, but to reveal us. So I hope today's reflection offers you a glimpse, a small ray of understanding. If you wish to explore more about consciousness, death, rebirth, and the inner dimensions of the human mind, I invite you to subscribe. This channel does not speak of death to frighten you. It speaks of death to illuminate life. In our next lecture, we will explore the soul's second day after death, the lights of the deities and the visions born of desire. Your subscription is not simply a click. It is a conscious step toward the light of understanding. Thank you.